So that's it for this instrumentation. What we have done, and that shows you our political interest in this thing with my colleague Lascombe, and I will go very quickly, is can we do a typology? You know, when we have no ideas and we're lost and we don't have pure theory, we do a typology, you know, classic social science thing. This is useful. But basically, the idea is, okay, the argument in a lot of literature, think about EU or think about technical systems, that we have lots of new policy instruments, a lot of innovations in policy instruments, okay? And you can document that. You can show, and I understand in lots of papers here in the next day, we will see a lot of that. You can show lots of new policy instruments. The problem we have is that there's a sort of fetishism of new policy instrument. And at the EU level, in particular, you have all the literature of a new policy instruments, of a new governance, of a new Europe, of a new millennium. You are fed up with all this thing, okay? How much is it real innovation? How much does it tell us? So what we've done with our colleague Lascombe is to say, okay, how can we sort of make some sense? So we've done this small typology, just arguing very simply that you have classic policy instruments used by governments. You know? The classic policy instruments are basically law and tax or economic policy one way or another, okay? And in those classic policy instruments, you have a view of the world where the state is dominating in the name of a common good and the general interest is dominating a society and therefore is able to tax and to impose norms, okay? That's the classic political view of the relationship between those who governed and those who are governed. And these are classic policy instruments, and there are lots of them in those categories, okay? So we've tried to argue what is usually called new policy instruments. There are three types of policy instruments, which are not entirely new, of course, but which are more systematically used, apparently, in various policies. One is the rise of agreement and, you know, charters, partnership, contract, all these sort of things. And you have lots of them in lots of policies. And we argue that it leads to be explained by a different kind of political relationship. The idea about those policy instruments is that, as we have seen, we have lots of policy failures. I always tell my students in public policy, I know this is not glamorous, but you know, most of public policies, they actually fail. Most of them just don't work. And we have lots of books explaining why public policy fail. So the search for policy instruments and new policy instruments is also explained by lots of failures in public policy. This is the hidden secret. So one way to go beyond failure in public policy is to try to work better at the implementation stage. And in order to do that, those who governed, they try to negotiate with various actors. And this has been done in the Netherlands for a long time, for instance. But you try to mobilize various actors, you share with them the definition of the goals and the objective, and in exchange, they participate to the public policy at the implementation stage. They don't veto, they don't protest, they don't block the process. So it's not the view of the state beyond society and sort of governing society. It's much more state mobilizing various groups and trying to achieve, by negotiating the common goals, classic analysis in planning, that some people know very well, and try to achieve some objective at the implementation stage. And so we argue there's a clear category of instruments which are maybe new or not new, we don't know exactly, but which have been systematically used in a number of policies in a number of countries. And it's a different category because of this political relationship that I've been mentioning from classic instrument. A second, information and communication, that will link to the view of the audience democracy, that when you govern, you need to convince people. Tony Blair in the UK be a good example. And the other one that you all know very well, what is very impressive in a number of public policies, is the rise and rise and rise of norms and standards and best practice, either technical or more normative in all sorts of ways. And again, the way you think about the political relationship, it's not just governing top-down, it's much more something relating to regulation. The idea that you set up norms and standards and then you let the actors to adapt to that in a competitive way. And then you can change the rules of the game. It's a very different way to govern from having a new law or a new tax system. So that was our idea. Let's try to identify from our different work this typology. And from there, could we try to document, to map out whether there is more or less policy instruments used over time? In other words, if you want to argue that there's a change of governance over time, and that modes of governance have changed over time, you should be able, that's the hypothesis, to document, to prove it, by looking at which policy instruments are used in different sectors. Okay? So, in a way, the book that Jan Peter has mentioned in French and the special issue of the journal that he has mentioned were the first phase of our research, which was case studies and carrier of policy instruments and trying to understand some specific effect. What I'm presenting now briefly is the second phase of our research, where we have said, okay, we have to do that. So we're going to do boring database to try to be able to document a bit more systematically where are these instruments coming from, when were we used, how do they combine with other. You know, we are a bit neo-institutionalist, so we know that a public policy is like a millefeuille. In English, it's a trifle cake, if I understand correctly. You know, you have layers and layers and layers. So when you look at any public policy, you realize that, of course, you have new policy instruments, but you have lots of old ones as well. So can we try to understand a little bit about this layers and layers of policy instruments? And of course, it would be interesting to try to understand how policy instruments travel from one sector to the next, from one level to the next. So we have designed a research in order to bring some elements along those lines. So this is the research project I'm going to present briefly now, which I do with my colleague Charlotte Halpern from Grenoble. And I will present the EU dimension. But basically, what we have been doing with Charlotte is to argue, okay, let's try to know a bit more about innovation in policy instruments. Can we design a methodology to do that? So what we have done is to be very blunt and robust. I mean, I'm a great believer in robust methodologies when you are in a very complex world. We're not entirely sure where you are. So we said, okay, let's take two policies that we know a bit and look over 30 or 40 or 50 years and try to compare in one sector, let's take environment policy, take the environment policy sector, you try to define that, you look over 30 or 40 years and you try to map out every instrument being used over time. Okay? And to do that, you try to identify each instrument. I'll show you an identity card. And then to see which ones are used over time. Which one are new, where do they come from, and what does it tell us? Okay? And what we've been doing is this for environment in France, Britain, Germany, and the EU. And then urban policy, France, Germany, Britain, and the EU. So we have 8 databases with between 30 and 70 policy instruments. And we try to understand, number one, to document them, to map them, to see the evolution over time, to see where they come from, the combination over time, and the circulation. Okay, so it's quite an ambitious project. We may do a book one day. For the time being, we're just doing some papers. I come back to the basic idea. Policy change can be explained by policy instruments, disconnected from the goal. Public policy may be considered, we agreed this doesn't make sense. We know there are lots of other things in public policy. We're just pushing the argument up to the limit to see what we can show, okay? But we are very, if you tell us sometimes public policy is explained by ideas, yes, no problem. Huh? But we're just pushing it in the sectors. Does innovation matter? But how much? How much innovation is going there? And how is innovation working? Where are things coming from, okay? And we try to look at the long-term effect, migration, circulation of policy instruments. So 2 sectors, 4 different political systems, EU and national, so you can have up and downs. On paper, it looks very good when you identify it. And you have this huge database. We are nearly finished the database. I will show the EU thing.